She always teased me like I was still a boy. But the night she said, "You could never handle a woman like me," something changed. And proving her wrong became the moment that changed everything between us. I never expected the evening to turn into anything memorable. It was supposed to be one of those ordinary visits, a casual drop-in at the house where I'd practically grown up, a place that carried the comfort of childhood summers and the smell of familiar cooking. She was there, of course. She always was. She had been part of my life for as long as I could remember, an older family friend who had slipped into the role of a protective, teasing, big sister over the years. At 42, she carried herself with a kind of graceful confidence that made her presence impossible to ignore. We were sitting across from each other in the living room, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, a lazy smirk tugging at her lips. The conversation had been light, playful, filled with the kind of banter that always came so easily between us. I had just finished telling a story about work, something about handling a chaotic day with my manager, when she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. Her eyes glinted with amusement, and that's when she said it. "You!" She laughed, tilting her head. "You couldn't handle someone like me." It was meant as a joke, I knew that. Her tone was playful, her smile deliberate. But the words landed differently. Maybe it was the wine, maybe the soft, golden glow of the lamp behind her, or maybe just the way her voice dipped at the end, carrying a subtle challenge beneath the laughter. Whatever it was, I felt the remark settle deep in my chest, heavier than she likely intended. I chuckled, pretending not to read into it, but my heart gave me away. It thudded harder than it should have. And suddenly I wasn't just looking at her as I always had, I was noticing her. The way her dark hair, pulled loosely over one shoulder, caught the light. The faint laugh lines at the corner of her eyes that only made her smile warmer. The delicate way her fingers circled the rim of her glass absent-mindedly, nails painted in a muted shade that suited her perfectly. I tried to play along, leaning back with a grin. "Is that so?" I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She raised a brow, clearly enjoying herself, and shrugged. "Absolutely. You're still too young, too inexperienced. A boy playing at being a man." Her words carried a teasing sharpness, but there was a softness in her gaze, as though she didn't fully believe what she was saying. That mixture, the laughter, the teasing, the quiet undertone I couldn't quite name, left me unsettled. My chest was tight, and for the first time, I was caught wondering what it might mean to prove her wrong. Her laughter faded into a smile, and she sipped her wine, her eyes lingering on mine a moment longer than they should have. I told myself it was nothing. Just a joke. Just her being her. But the truth is, that one sentence stayed with me long after the night was over. She had always been in that role, the steady, teasing presence who hovered just a little older, a little wiser, always looking out for me in ways that were both comforting and infuriating. When I was a kid, she made sure I ate something before running off with friends. In my teenage years, she'd roll her eyes at my bravado, reminding me not to get myself into trouble. And even now, at 24, she still had that way of speaking to me like I was someone she had to keep an eye on, someone not quite finished growing up. But ever since that night, when she teased me about not being able to handle someone like her, the way I looked at her had started to change. Or maybe it wasn't just me, maybe she had changed too. It was hard to tell. What I did know was that I caught myself noticing things I'd overlooked before, things that had always been there but had never mattered the same way. One evening, I sat at her kitchen table while she fussed with dinner. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic, the soft hum of her favorite old jazz record filling the space between us. It was a simple scene, something we'd shared 100 times before, yet the energy felt different. She moved around the kitchen with a kind of ease, her bare feet silent against the tiled floor, her hair tied back loosely in a way that left strands falling along her cheek. I found myself watching her more than I should have, catching the graceful lines of her movements, the way the light brushed across her skin when she leaned over the counter. When she finally sat down across from me, she slid a bowl in front of me and reached for the sugar jar near my hand. Our fingers brushed. Just for a moment. A fleeting, ordinary touch. But the heat that jumped between us was anything but ordinary. I froze, waiting for her to pull away quickly, but she didn't. Her fingers lingered just long enough for me to wonder if she felt it too. Then, with a soft laugh, she stirred her tea and looked away as if nothing had happened. I tried to join in her laugh, to pretend it hadn't rattled me, but my chest was still tight from that spark. Later, as she spoke about her day, the little frustrations at work, the neighbor who borrowed her ladder and forgot to return it, I found myself listening differently. Her words mattered in a way they hadn't before, like every detail was a window into who she was beneath the playful armor. And when she smiled across the table, her eyes soft, I felt something shift inside me. It was the same table, the same woman, the same rhythm we'd always had. But suddenly the lines we never dared to cross didn't seem quite so fixed anymore. It was raining the night her teasing shifted into something else. Not the light, playful kind of teasing I'd grown used to, but something quieter, edged with a weight I couldn't ignore. We were sitting near the window, mugs of tea warming our hands as rain streaked the glass. The world outside was blurred and muted, the steady patter filling the silences between our words. She had pulled a blanket loosely over her lap, her hair tucked behind one ear, those stray strands fell forward whenever she tilted her head. I was trying not to stare at her too openly, but the truth was, lately, I found myself memorizing her more than listening to what she said. At some point, our conversation turned back to me, my age, my work, the way I was finding my place in the world. She smiled that knowing smile, the one that always carried a trace of mischief, and said softly, "You're still just a boy in my eyes." I laughed, though it came out more forced than I intended. A boy? I'd like to think I've grown up at least a little. Her smile lingered, but then something shifted. Her voice lowered, almost drowned by the rain as she added, "Though sometimes I wonder." She looked away quickly, her fingers fidgeting with the thin bracelet around her wrist. It was the smallest gesture, but it caught me off guard. She was never one to fumble with her words, never one to look nervous. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her confidence, the hesitation in her eyes. The comment should have been another tease, nothing more. But it wasn't. I felt it in the pause that followed, in the way she avoided my gaze, in the slight tremor of her voice when she finally asked, "Do you ever think about how people would see it? If someone like me, and someone like you..." She trailed off, shaking her head as if the thought itself was reckless. I didn't know what to say at first. My chest tightened, my heart beat a steady thrum in my ears. There was a part of me that wanted to close the space between us, to tell her that I didn't care what people thought. That what mattered was the way her presence steadied me, the way her laughter softened the hardest parts of my days, the way her nearness made everything feel more alive. Instead, I stayed quiet. Too cautious, too afraid of saying something that would shatter the fragile moment. The rain carried on outside, heavy and relentless. She finally glanced back at me, her expression unreadable, as though she regretted saying anything at all. But I couldn't unhear it. The words, the way her guard slipped just for a second, it was a confession, even if she tried to disguise it as another joke. And as I sat there, watching her turn her gaze back toward the window, I realized something had changed. The teasing had always been light-hearted before, but now it was different. Now it carried something real beneath it. Something neither of us could laugh away. It happened on an evening that, at first, felt like nothing special. I'd stopped by her place after work, just to check in, maybe share dinner, the way we often did. But when I walked in, I found her standing in the living room, staring up at the ceiling with a frustrated look on her face. A small leak had sprung from the corner where the roof met the wall, rainwater from the last storm seeping through and leaving a dark stain. She had a bucket under it, but the annoyance in her expression told me it had been going on longer than she'd admitted. "Don't bother," she sighed when she saw me eyeing the ladder she'd leaned against the wall. "The last guy I called said he'd fix it, and look where that got me. You'll just hurt yourself." Something in me stiffened. Her words weren't cruel, but they carried the same tone she often used, protective, slightly dismissive, as though I was still the kid who needed looking after. Normally, I might have laughed it off. But tonight, I felt the urge to show her something different. "I'll be careful," I said firmly, already rolling up my sleeves. "Just let me try." Before she could argue further, I climbed the ladder and got to work. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just tightening a few loose fittings, patching the gap with the sealant she'd left sitting unused. But the act of doing it, of handling something that had clearly weighed on her, mattered more than the task itself. When I finally came back down, wiping my hands on a rag, she was standing with her arms crossed, watching me. But her expression had softened. There was something new in her eyes, a mix of surprise, relief, and something quieter, something that almost looked like admiration. "You actually fixed it," she said after a pause, her voice softer than before. I smiled, trying to keep my tone light. "Told you I could handle it." She didn't laugh. Not right away. Instead, she stepped closer, reaching out to touch my forearm. Her fingers lingered there, warm against my skin, a simple gesture but weighted with more meaning than either of us spoke aloud. "Thank you," she murmured. It wasn't just gratitude for the repair. I could hear it in her voice. It was thanks for being steady, for stepping up without hesitation, for proving, in some small way, that I wasn't the boy she thought I still was. The touch lasted only a moment before she pulled back, tucking her hair behind her ear with a kind of self-consciousness I rarely saw from her. But the impression it left, the warmth of her hand, the softness of her tone, stayed with me long after. That night, as I left her house, I realized it wasn't the roof I'd repaired. It was something else, something between us. Something fragile, but quietly shifting. It was late, later than either of us usually stayed up, when the conversation turned toward places we'd never gone before. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet where every little sound seemed louder, the soft hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the occasional sigh of wind brushing against the windows. We were sitting on her sofa, the lamplight casting a gentle amber glow across the room, making the shadows feel soft and safe. She had pulled her legs up under the blanket, curling into one corner of the couch. I sat at the other end, though the space between us seemed to shrink the longer we talked. Our voices were low, careful, as if raising them might break whatever fragile thread had formed in the air. "I don't know," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the mug in her hands. "Sometimes it feels like life has already decided things for me. Like I'm just filling in the spaces that are left." I tilted my head, trying to read her expression. "What do you mean?" She gave a small laugh, but it wasn't her usual laugh. It was thinner, unguarded. "I mean, look at me. I'm 42. Most people my age are settled, certain. Married, or divorced and remarried. They've checked all the boxes. And here I am, drinking tea on my sofa with you, wondering if maybe I missed something along the way." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Not because of what she said, but because of the way she said it, soft, almost apologetic, as though admitting loneliness was something she wasn't used to. I wanted to tell her that she hadn't missed anything, that her life wasn't lacking just because it didn't look like everyone else's. I wanted to tell her how much I admired her independence, her strength, the way she carried herself with grace no matter what. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I shifted closer. Just a little. Close enough that my knee brushed against hers under the blanket. She didn't pull away. "I don't think you've missed anything," I said finally. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I think you've just taken a different path. And maybe that path isn't finished yet." She looked at me then, really looked at me, her eyes searching mine as though trying to decide whether she could believe me. Slowly, she leaned back against the sofa cushion, her shoulder brushing against mine. And then, almost hesitantly, she let her head rest against my shoulder. The moment was so small, yet it felt monumental. The warmth of her cheek through the fabric of my shirt, the steady rhythm of her breathing, it was all so simple, and yet it carried more intimacy than any embrace I'd ever known. I draped my arm around her, tentative at first, but when she didn't move away, I let it settle there, holding her quietly. For a long time, we didn't speak. The only sound was the ticking clock and the gentle hum of her breath. In that silence, the truth pressed against both of us. This was no longer just playful teasing, no longer just an old familiar closeness. It was something deeper, something neither of us could ignore anymore. The night after our long conversation, the air between us felt different. Softer, quieter, but charged in a way that words couldn't quite reach. It wasn't that anything dramatic happened. In fact, it was the simplicity of it that made it linger in my chest. She was sitting at the edge of her bed, brushing out her hair. I had followed her there after helping her lock up the house, both of us moving almost as if in a dream, as though neither wanted to say goodnight just yet. The lamplight spilled across her, warm and golden, catching in the strands of her hair as she drew the brush through with slow, practiced strokes. I stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitant, watching. She looked up at me with a small smile that carried no pretense. Just tiredness, trust, and something else, something she wasn't saying aloud. Without thinking, I walked closer and crouched down in front of her. She raised a brow in quiet amusement, but didn't stop me. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "Let me," I said, reaching for the brush in her hand. Her fingers lingered against mine as she let it go. The brush was warm from her touch, and when I drew it carefully through her hair, I felt her whole body relax, a sigh escaping her lips as if she hadn't realized how much she needed that gentleness. I took my time, careful not to tug, letting the rhythm of the motion settle between us like an unspoken promise. When I set the brush down, I leaned closer, brushing one last loose strand back from her face with my fingertips. My hand lingered at her cheek, the curve of her skin soft and impossibly warm beneath my touch. For a moment, she simply closed her eyes, leaning into my palm as though she had been waiting for that kind of contact far longer than either of us had admitted. Her hand came up then, finding mine, weaving our fingers together. It was the smallest of gestures, yet it sent a weighty silence across the room. There were no words, none were needed. The simple act of her holding my hand, of allowing herself to lean into me, was proof enough. I felt her thumb graze the side of my hand, a tiny movement, tender and deliberate. My heart hammered in response, not out of nervousness this time, but out of the overwhelming realization that she trusted me. She didn't need declarations or bravado. She needed this, my quiet presence, my steadiness, my willingness to stand beside her without forcing her to speak what she wasn't ready to. The world outside the window was dark, but in that room, it felt as though everything was illuminated. We sat there, her head resting lightly against me, our hands locked together. And in that silence, I didn't have to prove anything with words. She already knew. Morning light has a way of softening everything. When I woke in her guest room, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. No rain this time, no ticking clock, just the hushed stillness of a house at rest. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night before in my mind, the weight of her hand in mine, the way she leaned into me without hesitation, the silence that spoke louder than words. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, I found her in the kitchen. She was barefoot, hair loosely pinned up, the sleeves of her sweater pushed back as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. Sunlight streamed through the window, washing her in pale gold, and for a second I just stood there, memorizing the moment. She looked at peace, softer than I'd ever seen her. "Morning," she said when she noticed me, her voice gentle, unguarded. She slid one of the mugs across the counter toward me. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth soak into my fingers. "Morning." For a while, we didn't speak much. We sipped our coffee in the quiet, the air filled with the faint sound of birds outside. It wasn't awkward. If anything, it felt natural, like we were both adjusting to this new shape between us. Finally, she set her mug down and looked at me with that same half-smile she'd given me the night before. "You know," she said, tilting her head, "I think I owe you an apology." I raised a brow. "For what?" "For underestimating you." Her smile widened, though there was a softness behind it. "For teasing you all those times, saying you couldn't handle me." "Maybe I was wrong," Her words settled into me slowly, like sunlight warming stone. There was no joking tone this time, no disguise of laughter. Just honesty. I stepped closer, leaning against the counter beside her. Maybe, I said quietly, I wanted to prove you wrong. She looked up at me then, her eyes steady, searching. And after a long pause, she slipped her hand into mine. No hesitation, no teasing this time, just a simple, deliberate choice. Her fingers laced with mine as though they had always belonged there. We didn't need to label it, didn't need to say the words out loud. It was enough to feel her hand warm against mine, to know that she had stopped hiding behind her playful armor. She had let me see her vulnerability, and in return, she had accepted my presence as something real, something she could lean on. Later, as we stepped outside for a walk, the morning air was crisp and bright. The street was quiet, sunlight glinting off the wet pavement from the storm the night before. Without thinking, she slipped her hand into mine again. This time, it wasn't a test or a tease. It was simply us. And as we walked side by side, our steps falling naturally in sync, I realized she was right. Maybe I hadn't been able to handle her before. But now, in the quiet steadiness of the morning, I knew I could. And I knew I would.